Hi, welcome back to the Amazon Personalize Deep Dive video series. This is episode 2, Understanding Your Data with Amazon Personalize, and I'm Chris King, an Applied AI Solutions Architect here at AWS. This is the second video in the initial 5-part introduction series. Earlier, you should have seen a service introduction video, goes kind of over the entire process. Definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't already. This video will focus on mapping your data into the actual service itself. Up next, use cases, then integrating personalization, and then how do you take a POC and scale that into production. These first 5 videos will cover all the basics of getting started with the service, making sure you're familiar and that you're following best practices as you launch solutions with the service. However, we also have upcoming videos listed here that are going to be deep dives into particular topics, so definitely make sure to check those out later. Before getting started in the data though, it's probably helpful just to recap quickly a little bit about Amazon Personalize itself. So we do start with data still, that's on the left. You can see we look at interaction data first. Clicks, purchases, conversions, any kind of behavioral data or interaction data, that's what we're looking for. Next comes item metadata. So that's information about your products or videos. Think of it like genre or product color or maybe even category information. Then there's user metadata. This is any kind of demographic data to better explain your user's behavior and to help make sense when filtering or doing any kind of custom queries later. Once that data exists, you can feed it into Amazon Personalize, which is a fully managed machine learning solution. It will take care of inspecting the data, identifying the features, training models, actually optimizing them, and then hosting them. And at the end of this, you end up with a customized personalization API. This API is going to let you deliver recommendations inside your application, cache them, or really integrate them across your product and portfolio. There are a couple of core use cases for Amazon Personalize. We start with user-specific recommendations. So this is a user, give me the things that are really relevant for this user. Next come user cold starts. This is a net new user to your platform. Item cold starts, which are when new items exist on your platform. How do you best integrate those? Similar items, really popular use case here where you give one item and then what items are similar in the way your users interact with them. Personalized ranking, this is where you give a user and a collection of items and Personalize will reorder them in most probable likelihood for your particular user. And then there's popularity. This is just counting what are the most popular items in terms of raw interaction count numbers on your platform. And kind of we would consider this the worst baseline for recommendation. So we always want to be doing better than popularity. Now let's cover some dataset characteristics. It's really important to start with a large collection of known users. This means your users are identified or authenticated consistently, so you have a history of their behavior. And that history needs to look like at least 10 interactions per user for most of your users. Now, obviously you'll have some that only interact a few times here and there, that's fine. But you want to have, dataset collections where you have a rich history with your users. And those items need to be immutable. So by immutability, we mean, the item is roughly the same for one user as it is for another. This works great, obviously, for digital assets, but it's also workable when you think about physical goods. So if 2 people purchase the same item, let's say dinnerware, it's going to be roughly the same dinnerware when it arrives. That's fine. And then finally, 50 or more items. We're using machine learning approaches to generate recommendations, and below 50 items, it's not really an optimal solution for figuring out what's the best approach. So for this case, we are focusing on data sets where you have more than 50 items. But it's helpful to think about, what is interaction data? Earlier, we talked about clicks or purchases, but let's dive in a little bit deeper here. And that's information that comes from monitoring the actions of users or customers on a platform and showcases how they interact with items that you are looking to recommend. This can come from purchases, clicks, shares, likes, or browsing. But really the cornerstone here is that you're going to have a user, you're going to have an item, and a particular timestamp at least when that interaction occurred. But in addition to interaction data, it can be helpful to think about what kind of data can make sense for items or users and why. And so here we're going to talk about item and user metadata. And the first question is, what kind of content would you like to filter on? So if you're thinking like a media example that we'll be working on in a moment, genre works really well for this. So it's an attribute that very often you want to filter on and have recommendations scoped to that category. Additionally, you might want to think about what kind of attributes are impactful for your users. So these are things that help Personalize understand why was this item of interest to the user? What about it made it special, and how is it similar to other items? But with that becomes this final question: what data do you have available? Just because you have something that's really specialized for one item, if you don't have similar attributes for your other items, it doesn't make it a good candidate. We want to see data sets that are rich and really filled out, not very sparse information. So if it's only available for a handful of your items, probably best to leave that out as a feature. But now that you have an idea of what's appropriate for the service, we'll actually walk through this in an example in a Jupyter notebook. And from that, we'll build a data set first, save it locally. Then we're going to walk through the process using the AWS console to see how do we actually import it into Amazon Personalize. And from there, you'll be ready for the next video series on use cases. Okay, so now we're ready to get started with actually building a data set with Amazon Personalize. In this case, we're going to use a Jupyter notebook to walk through all the steps and provision the data set. However, you can do any kind of data wrangling tool that you have that you're familiar with is totally fine. This just works really well for educational purposes. Additionally, this notebook will be available. There'll be a link to it in the description below, and it'll be updated with any kind of improvements we work in later. We're going to use the Movie Lens dataset, which covers 25 million interactions between users and movies, and that'll help us build a really performant model. So the first thing to do is to actually download this dataset. That'll take a few seconds. Once this is done, we've actually extracted it, and now we can take a look at all the files that are available. And here we see just a small collection of CSVs. The ratings happens to be the one that includes all our interactions, so let's take a look at what that looks like. First, we'll need to import a few Python libraries, and then use Pandas, which is a data frame library for Python, kind of a data science library, to read the CSV and then get started. And here we can see we have a data set that contains a user ID, a movie ID, a rating, and a timestamp. This is almost perfect for Amazon Personalize right out of the gate. It's a user interacting with a movie and at a particular time. Rating is something that we can then start to use in more interesting ways later. Before we get started, let's validate that we actually do have the right number of interactions as well as users and movies. So first thing, we'll take a look at users. We can see we have over 162,000 of those. For movies, we have over 59,000 of those, well above our 50 threshold. And for the number of interactions, this is greater than 25 million. Generally speaking, or I think it's actually the minimum is 2,500 interactions, so we are well over that. Looks like a great data set to build a movie or a movie recommendation engine with. And so for this, we just want to validate that this timestamp we see here, which we think is Unix epoch time, we want to make sure that it is by rendering it into human readable format, just to make sure we're dealing with a relatively modern data set. And this we can see is 2006, May 17th. Perfect, that'll work great. Now we can just focus on building the data set in a way that's optimum for Amazon Personalize. Something to note here is we see users, movies, and ratings, and these look to be out of 5 stars. The problem, though, is Personalize does not understand negative feedback. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is just remove any item that didn't get a 3 or higher. So we'll start by doing that. And now we need to think about how to apply, show that a 5 is really better than a 3. We could certainly just put in an event value and say that, 3 is better than 5. Hopefully that'll, trend in some way. Or what we can do is use the ratings to give us different types of simulated interactions. And what we're going to do here is say that if it's greater than a 4, it constitutes that the movie was fully watched. And if it's just greater than or equal to 3, it's simply a click. So think about the interest you might see from browsing something versus something that you fully watched. And that's what we're trying to replicate here by manipulating the data set in this way. Granted, this would be a great time to look at your actual data and then implement these strategies against your own data set. So you wouldn't have to necessarily split and make this kind of imaginary. You could build it right on your real data. Now that this is done, it's time to combine those values back together. So this will give us one data set of both the clicked and the watched data. And when we're ready, we can actually save this out as a CSV. So we'll see we have a user ID, an item ID, and a timestamp. And we now will save that as a CSV file. This process will take just a few seconds, so we'll wait for this to complete before carrying on. You can see that it does complete whenever the star has a number inside of it. Now that that's done, it's time to build an IAM role. We're going to need this when we switch over to the Amazon console or AWS console in order to give Personalize the rights to perform certain actions like importing our data set. So we'll just give this a new name. And we'll run this cell. This will take 60 seconds while it sleeps, so we can just pause for a second and then pick right up where we left off. We'll know that it's finished when it prints the ARN here below. Okay, now that we have an ARN, we're almost done with the notebook for the time being. What we will now want to do is fetch the data that we created for our interactions data set. So to do that, I'm going to expand here, open my data folder, and I have this interaction CSV, which I'm going to download first. If you did this on your local machine, you don't have to worry about that. And if you're doing this with any other utility, all that matters is that you have access to that CSV file. So the next thing is to wait for that to finish downloading before we upload it to S3. Okay, the next thing that we'll want to do is create a bucket. So for this, we're going to just give it, a nice name. This is a Personalize video demo episode 2. Should be relatively unique name. I recommend throwing in your account ID here if it's not unique. Default options are fine for us, so we'll hit next. And we will hit next again. Defaults are all fine. And we're going to turn off public access. We certainly don't want any files getting leaked out, so we'll hit next. And then create bucket. Once the bucket exists, we can actually click this and upload our file. So we'll click upload, add files, and then select our interactions data set here, choose it, and hit next. Defaults are all fine again. Make sure that your user has access to it, and we'll hit next, next, and upload. And we'll just wait a few seconds for this process to finish. After a few minutes, your interactions file should be fully uploaded. Once it's completed, you'll see the file name here, and we're ready to move on to the next phase. Before we can get started though, we actually do need to apply bucket level permissions to this S3 bucket. So what we'll do is click the Permissions tab. From there, we will click the Bucket Policy tab, and you're going to want to paste a policy here. We've actually have a policy. Again, it'll be documented in the external content, but here we can see we're going to pull it up. This is the policy. The important thing to change is making sure that your bucket is updated here in the bucket name. This is going to let Amazon Personalize get access to our data inside S3. So now we'll paste that policy here and we'll click Save. This is done. Now the policy is all good to go. Just save again just to make sure. Classic video game technique. And now we're ready to continue. To do that, we'll go to Amazon Personalize inside the AWS console. So the first thing to do when we pull up the service is click this Get Started link. This is going to ask us to create a dataset group. A dataset group is the largest isolated container of information inside Amazon Personalize. So any information in one dataset group can't adverse or really impact in any way any other dataset group, either within your own account or across accounts. This makes them ideal candidates for isolating experiments and letting you know which recommendation approach is working best. So to get started, we'll just give it a name. Dataset, or actually DSG for dataset group. We'll hit next. The next thing to do is import our user item interaction data. That's the data we just uploaded to S3. So we'll call this actions DS for dataset. And we want to create a new schema. The schema is what describes our dataset. So we'll create that. We'll give it a name. And for this, what we want to do is first bring in the data that we actually formatted previously. So again, I've made some notes. Scroll down here to see these. But what we have is a user ID, an item ID, an event type, that click or watch, as well as a timestamp. So I'll just copy only the fields attribute and replace the content that's here in the console by default, just the fields attribute. And with that, we're ready to hit next. And now fill in some details about where Personalize can find our files. And to do that, we start with an import name. So this will be tutorial import 1. And now we're going to be asked for an ARN. This is the last thing that we created inside the Jupyter notebook. This ARN tells Personalize where it can find IAM access to go and try to fetch our data. So we'll paste that ARN here. After inputting the ARN, we can get started with just putting in our location, which is S3 whack whack. And what we want to do is get our bucket name. So if we go back, we can grab the bucket name from here. That's the notes we took earlier when building our bucket policy. Paste that / interactions.csv. And from that, we can hit finish. And now Personalize will go off and try to fetch our content and import it into the Personalize service. We'll see this working in just a moment when this changes over to a create pending. Here we see it. This process should take about 15 minutes. We'll check back in once this is done to start importing our item metadata. After a little bit of time, around 15 or 20 minutes, you'll see this user item interaction data begin to say active. Once this is showing active, it's now time for us to get started importing our item metadata. In fact, if you're doing this at your own pace later, even when that other one's in progress, you can go back to the notebook, get started on the item metadata. Just for kind of keeping it very linear for tutorial purposes, we've waited. So here, this is now active. We know everything's working kind of end to end. We can go back to the notebook and build our item metadata dataset. So to do that, we'll once again use pandas. We're going to read in the movies file and take a look at the content. And here we can see we have a movie ID, a title, and a genre. We can get some more information about it and see that we have roughly 62,000 entries. Now, something that's interesting is this movie ID is the same ID we saw in our earlier file, so that's going to be kind of the connection to it. The genre is going to act as metadata, so we can see the bar operator here giving us a few valid choices for this entry. But the title is a little interesting. It gives us, the year that it was published as well as the title, but this information isn't really structured in anything that's meaningful. So if, for example, words were duplicated between these entries, Personalize wouldn't really be able to learn anything from that. So we're not going to need title going forward. We just want to reduce down to only the movie ID and the genre. So we're going to get started with that. And now we can see we just have movie ID and genre. Take a look to validate those are our only types. That's correct. And now we want to build or rename the columns before we export the file. So this will set it as genre and item ID. So we'll do that. And now we'll create a CSV file. Just like we did with the interaction data, we're going to want to download that file locally first, then ship it to S3. So we'll start by downloading the file. Then we'll go to S3 and we will upload the same file. So item metadata and choose it. Next, the defaults are all fine, so we'll hit next a few times as well as upload. And in just a few seconds, we now have our item metadata file loaded here into S3. So this is available. Now Personalize can get started using this file. To do that, we need to click this item data import area. So we'll click this first. And we kind of want to get started giving it a name. So this is going to be item metadata ds1 for the tutorial video. And we need to create a new schema. The schema is what describes the item to Personalize. So we'll hit create new and we'll give it a new name here. So item metadata ds1 schema. It's totally fine. And once again, we'll pull some resources we took out earlier from other notebooks that'll be linked below. But we'll just go ahead and copy this schema and we're going to paste it here. So we can see an item ID and a genre, and those coincide if we go back to our notebook with the item ID and genre here. So we can see the contents there. We know we're going to be ready to go. And at that point, we will hit next. And now it comes time to import. So we'll give this a nice import job name. So item metadata import 1. And we'll give it an ARN. This will be the same ARN we used previously. So we can scroll back up in the notebook to find it. And now the S3 path. So S3 : whack whack. Once again, we'll go back to our little notes here and fetch our bucket name and paste that here. And then lastly, we'll add the file name, which is just item-meta.csv. Now we can hit start import and the service should start. So we can see this create pending here. This again will take 10 or 15 minutes to import all of our data. Even though the files are very small, you'll notice that the file takes about the same time to process. That's because behind the scenes, Personalize is provisioning a lot of infrastructure to run this job, and that's taking the lion's share of the time with these smaller file sizes. So we'll give this just a pause before we're coming back and wrapping up the video. You should see that your item data is also available, as well as your user item interaction data. At this point, you're ready to start building recommendation models with Amazon Personalize. Those are going to be covered in upcoming videos. But before exiting back to the rest of the deck, we'll take a look at a few things here in the console. Clicking on datasets first, we can see we have both of these and they're active. So let's look at the user item interaction dataset first. We'll click that. We can see that it is active. We have this import job that completed. We can see our schema here. If we click the import, it'll give us a little bit of information of when it imported the data and that it's ready to go. At that point, we can go back to our dataset groups, see this overview here. And again, we'd see something very similar if we clicked datasets again and item data. We could see the version of exactly when this was imported. This will become more important later when you're continually feeding new data into the system. Thanks again for the time, but just to make sure everyone has all the resources they need, there's our developer documentation, a series of blog posts, our sample notebooks and reference architectures. The links below to specific snippets will be located inside this repository, and a link to the AWS Retail Demo Store. This is a deployment you can kick off within your own AWS account and provision a full retail-like environment with synthetic data using Amazon Personalize. Thanks again, and have a great day.